This video resource will discuss the Title I Part A LEA Written Parent and Family Engagement Policy requirement that is part of the random validation monitoring process conducted by the Federal Program Compliance Division at the Texas Education Agency. Documenting overall compliance for a program requirement may require several forms of documentation to be maintained locally and available upon request by TEA and/or an auditor. To ensure the overall compliance with program requirements, LEAs should refer to the program guide and/or other program-related resources that reference the multiple forms of documentation required to be maintained locally. The documentation requested for submission during the random validation process may not include all forms of documentation that are required to be maintained locally. Each LEA that receives Title I Part A funds must have a written parent and family engagement policy that is incorporated into the LEA plan and describes the LEA's expectations and objectives for meaningful parent and family engagement. For Item 1.1, the LEA must upload a copy of the LEA's written parent and family engagement policy for the current year. As we review the policy, we will be looking for evidence of the involvement of parents in the development and review of the LEA's PFE policy, parent input on policy development and the use of the LEA's PFE reservation of funds, and the involvement of parents in the annual evaluation of the LEA's PFE policy and activities. The LEA's PFE policy should describe how the LEA will reach out and engage in conversations with parents and families to gather meaningful feedback related to the policy. It should also describe when the LEA's PFE policy is typically reviewed and revised, the role of parents in this process, and when the revised policy is usually distributed and explained to parents. If the LEA is required to reserve Title I Part A funds for PFE activities, the LEA should describe in its LEA PFE policy how parent input on the use of those funds is obtained. The LEA should also include in its PFE policy a description of when the evaluation will be conducted, who will conduct the evaluation, when the findings will be made public, and the role of parents in these activities. Issues that may result in an improvement needed status include auditable documentation requested was not submitted, the LEA's PFE policy did not address the required activities, or documentation from a prior year was submitted instead of current year documentation. For items 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4, the LEA should submit a meeting agenda, meeting notes or minutes, and a participant roster for one meeting documenting the LEA's PFE policy development and review process. The LEA's policy development and review process may involve more than one meeting, in which case the LEA should maintain documentation from all such meetings to establish compliance. However, documentation from only one meeting is requested for this validation. The documentation submitted should provide evidence that the LEA's PFE policy development and review process referenced in Item 1.1 was followed. Issues that may result in an improvement needed status include auditable documentation requested was not submitted, The documentation submitted does not reference the LEA's PFE policy development and review process. The documentation submitted does not align to the LEA PFE policy item 1.1 documentation, or documentation from a prior year was submitted instead of current year documentation. Questions related to this random validation for Title I Part A may be referred to Jaime Huerta or Vivian Smurl at essasupport@tea.texas.gov.